I'm going to be painting a step-by-step watercolour flower painting of some beautiful white anemones. These are the materials that I'll be using, and you can find a full list of these in the description below. A sketch outline is available on my Patreon membership. Details about my Patreon membership can be found in the description below. So let's get started. First of all, I'm just going to give a random little spritz with my spritzer bottle on the surface of the paper just to get things loosened up. And now I'm using a little bit of the Phthalo Green, and the paints are a little bit dry. So what I would say is when you're starting with pans, which I'm using here, give it a spritz, as what I've just done with my spritzer bottle, about half an hour before you start using them, because it moistens them up and it really makes them much easier to use. So I'm adding a little bit of Cerulean there and a little bit now of the Quinacridone Gold, and I'm just making lots of yummy greens. So I'm going to leave it up to you. Just make a variety of colours that you want for your background, something that will inspire you, colours that you love. Here I am actually using some greens, some light greens. I used a little bit of the Quinacridone Gold, some of the purple, and some yellow here. It's quite a nice creamy colour. I'm mixing with my size 6 brush. This is the purple magenta, which is a beautiful colour, but you could use something like permanent rose, opera rose, permanent magenta, just a really lovely pink. So I'm using my large size 14 brush, and I'm loading it and picking up all these different colours and just painting very carefully around the edge of the anemone here, and just sort of keeping the colours loose. Because I sprayed the surface of the paper beforehand, you're going to get wet and dry areas, so it just creates random effects. And I really want to have this painting very loose, very expressive. I'm going to try and get some happy accidents happening in the background as well. But I'm working on light, mid and dark greens. I've just added a little bit of the cerulean there to that green as well. So you've got a lovely cool dark green here. It's a beautiful colour, that cerulean. Any cerulean will do, or you could even use Prussian blue or phthalo blue. And I'm just using the tip of the brush there to really cut in and let that colour sort of bleed out into the wet background. Now, if you're a little bit worried about the wet, sort of the wet on dry aspect of this, you could actually wet your background first and drop these colours in, whatever you find is easiest. The other thing I was going to say, if you're starting out in watercolour painting, you might want to work on a smaller scale to begin with, because it will give you more time and you will feel a little bit less panicked, because you're sort of trying to get the paint on before it dries. In this instance though, some backgrounds and those sort of textured marks are all there. Everything is fine. The only thing I would say is just don't overwork areas to stop the paint from becoming muddy. So just try and keep it really fresh, and almost just paint once and then sort of just rinse your brush, or just get some fresh paint and paint once again into the next wash. And I've got some water there, and I'm just softening and swishing and just trying to get some really nice expressive marks. And I'm painting up to the stem there, but actually I could have painted over the stem because the stem is going to be darker, but I didn't want to lose the line, because obviously it's watercolour pencil, it might dissolve too much. I'm using incredibly dark colour here. You could use some Payne's grey with some ultramarine with a bit of cerulean, and really have that quite dark, and it's quite dramatic. Remember, watercolour does dry lighter, and that wash is quite wet, so it will it's a bit of a puddle. So I've just pulled it out there as well, and I just fancied a bit of pink there. It's not in the background of the painting, but I just wanted to put that colour in there just because I felt like it, and to be expressive. So I'm just sort of softening that out there. I've swapped to my size 10 brush just to I found the size 14, even though I really sort of encourage you to use a large brush, but I find sometimes if you're cutting into a white flower where you don't want the paint to get on it really, I swap to a smaller brush just to give me that little bit more control. So this size 10 carries lots of paint still, but it doesn't feel like it's going to pour loads of paint onto my picture where I've got to try and protect the white anemone. So I'm just using a bit of Quinacridone Gold here, just working my way round. So for something like this, always prepare your washes beforehand so that it gives you more time. That's what I would recommend. And it makes it more enjoyable as well, so you're not panicking. I'm using a very creamy Quinacridone Gold here. I may have a little bit of the Perylene Violet in there as well, just to make it a little bit darker. And I've sprinkled a little bit of salt in that top right hand corner there because the paint was sort of drying off a little bit. So you still want a sheen there, but you don't want it to be too wet or too dry. And I tilted my painting there just to get things moving because there was a bit of a puddle as well. And because that didn't seem to do what I wanted it to do, I've just used a clean brush, taken the excess water off and just smoothed it out just to get a nice smooth edge there. So most of the darks are sort of concentrated around the flowers. And really I'm painting a lot of it now, damp into damp, or even wet on dry, but then softening on the outside edge. I'm just using some of my watercolour pencils now and just ordinary rough sandpaper, and I'm just using some green here and just rubbing it against sandpaper, and the pigment comes off and falls onto the wet surface. Make sure it is a wet surface, and that way it sticks on nicely. And I'm just painting in this, I forgot the centre of all things, so I'm just painting this centre now with my size 10 brush. It is wet on dry, but as I sort of paint a paler wash on, I'll drop some wet or damp washes in there, again being very careful not to get any paint onto the anemone, and just working my way around the shape, really trying to make the edge of the petal very interesting. I'm using a little bit of the pink, a little bit of the Quinacridone Gold, and just dropping now a little bit of a creamier colour in there. And I've got the Perylene Green there as well. It's a beautiful dark greyish green, really, it's gorgeous, and I'm just dropping that in there as well. You could use something like olive green, and black would make quite a nice Perylene Green, but or sort of, you know, a similar sort of colour, but any sort of colours, Viridian and Burnt Umber. I love sort of playing around with different colour mixes, so don't feel just because you haven't got these colours you can't sort of experiment with your own colours and your own favourite colours as well. So I'm just using some lighter greens at the bottom here. It can be a mixture of yellow and a touch of cerulean, and just, oh, I've got a little bit more cerulean there now, really nice and creamy, cutting into the edge. Now I wasn't sure about this cerulean when I first got this little set, but I really like the way it dries off a little bit. It's almost like a phthalo turquoise. Now don't worry about even putting watery paint on, creamier paint, because you're going to get all these lovely textures. I love this style of painting because you can break all those watercolour rules. And I'm just tilting now to let all the paint run down to create some more interesting textures, and just, it's such a freeing up feeling, you know, and you're just dropping in all these lovely colours. But remember, just keep it fresh and don't sort of go back and forth, be very sort of disciplined when you're dropping in the paint. And I'm just letting this drizzle down. I love what's happening with the watercolour pencil shavings at the top there. It's gorgeous. Now I'm using my spritzer bottle just to, at the bottom here, just to make everything sort of fade away, so those darks aren't too prominent at the bottom. And just remember always to wipe away your puddles that you've left either on your table surface and on the bottom of the painting there as well. I don't want all that to run back up into my picture. So I'm just painting on the right hand side of this main anemone here with some cerulean with a touch of yellow. And I've just realised that a little bit of the paint, the previous wash, has gone up into the petal, which I'm just starting to realise now. So I'm just got some clean water there, and I'm just sort of just manoeuvring the paint. When this happens, whatever you do, don't panic. And I'm just always put some water on first and then lift off. I've decided I'm just going to leave that smudge there. We can work that out later. I'm just sprinkling a little bit of the sea salt now. You can use table salt just to create, it'll lift off, it'll soak up that paint and create some lovely textures. As you can see, that's already developed on the top right hand side. I'm using a little bit of lemon yellow with my size 6 brush, working wet on dry, and now adding a little bit of the Chronium Yellow Deep. You could use lemon yellow or cadmium yellow light with cadmium yellow deep, and if you don't have any of that, you can add a tiny bit of orange or red to it. Again, there's lots of ways you can work around the colour mixing here. And what I'm doing now is I'm just pulling out some of that colour using those yellows. That deeper colour, deeper yellow is such a beautiful colour. It's almost like orange, and I'm just sort of dabbing in and making little stippling marks just around the outside edge there, keeping it really nice and loose. Again, I'm using some sandpaper here with some limey green watercolour pencil and just sprinkling that on the surface. If you don't have that, don't worry, you can just use a little bit of stippling of some green paint, which I actually will do later on in the paintings. And I'm using the watercolour pencil now just to give a little bit of texture as well. And here's a little close-up of some more of the sandpaper with a touch of the burnt umber, and I'm using a little bit of the red watercolour pencil here, but again you can use a little bit of an orangey red later, wet on dry with your brush, so don't worry if you haven't got the watercolour pencils. But I just thought it'd be fun for you to watch and see and try these sort of alternative sort of media out as well. I was quite inspired by some of you on the Facebook page where you were actually using watercolour and watercolour pencils, so this is in homage to you, so thank you for that. So I just thought I'd sort of use the combination here, which is really nice, and you kind of feel a little bit in control. I'm using a little bit of green watercolour pencil here as well, and just to give that little bit of texture. Remember, less is more. I've got a very, very dilute Quinacridone Gold here, and I mean dilute. You just want to give a hint of warmth to these white petals. You do not want to make them yellow petals. So I'm just painting them around, wet on dry, just sort of smudging them on with my size 14 brush, really sort of large sort of marks, and be really bold and brave. Be the boss of your painting if you can. Don't let it boss you about. And I'm mixing up now some of the Perylene Violet with a touch of green, and I'm just painting this around that sort of bottom edge of the centre of the flower, and where I've wet it with a very pale yellow, it's running in, and it's just sort of creating these lovely soft effects. I'm rinsing my brush now, size 6 brush, and I'm just softening this edge here, pushing it into the center a little bit, just to kind of push it up there, you know, take that excess off, just sort of feel that sort of control that you get with the watercolor here. As you can see, always keep rinsing your brush. If in doubt, rinse your brush. If you find when you wipe the brush on the side of the pot that it's still too wet, just use a bit of kitchen towel, dab it so it gives you more control. I'm painting some of this Perylene Violet with a touch of blue in the center of this flower here. I've even got a little bit of Payne's grey, working from the outside in with a clean brush. I'm just softening, so you've got this sort of dark to light effect, and it looks beautiful. I'm really pleased with that there. Again, rinsing my brush and just softening. I've just pushed a little bit of water in there, hoping it'll create a little bit of magic. I'm painting some soft shadows around this left-hand flower here, using a tiny touch of the pink, a little bit of very, very greyed down Payne's grey, and just putting a bit of this shadow colour underneath that sort of bottom petal there. Added a little bit of ultramarine now. It's a little bit almost too strong there. Remember, it's still damp from that yellow, very pale yellow wash I put on earlier. So I've just dropped a bit more water in and just softening as I go. Remember, it's experimenting. Don't be too hard on yourself. And the other thing I've always said to my students, don't have this sort of fixed image of how you want things to look at the end. Go with the flow of your painting and see where it takes you. It's such a mobile medium. It's got a mind of its own. We're just kind of sort of trying to keep it so it doesn't go too wild. So I'm just dropping in a little bit of very light violet there. Just very, very sort of pale, sort of neutral, cool tones. I've just lifted out that there because it went over the lighter area of the flower. I'm using my twig now just to scratch in to the surface of the paper. You could use the corner of your plastic card to do this as well, and I'm using that twig with just creamy neat paint straight from the pans and painting it sort of around that edge there, and also on the sort of the surface there to create veins in the flower there, but also to create some nice darks here and there as well. It's exciting to do, you know, creating these nice sort of marks here and there, using the twig and even wet on dry there as well. I'm using a little bit of the Ultramarine Violet, Payne's Grey, and even some of the Perylene Violet, so you can just use blue and grey with a touch of pink even, and just to create these cooler darks. So you can see where the one petal is creating a little bit of shadow over this bottom petal here. I'm using my size 6 brush to do this. It's got a little bit more control, and I'm just putting a little bit wet on dry. The paper's dried off a little bit here, and I'm just pushing clean water into that dark paint there just to soften it, so it sort of graduates out the tonal value. And I've just decided to drop a little bit more dark in there and just sort of tidying up the edges as well, and just seeing what happens, you know, sort of just playing around with the watercolor just to see what sort of delightful little textures and happy accidents we can come across. I'm trying to be as loose as I can, as creative as I can with the colors and the mark making and the techniques, and just seeing how we can bring these flowers to life. The most important thing is to keep the light on those flowers, on those two anemones there, so they look like white anemone. A good idea is to keep a piece of kitchen towel tissue in your other hand, just to dab every now and again, just to kind of really discipline yourself that you're not going to lose the light, you're not going to lose the light of that flower, and that's your kind of safety net there, just to keep dabbing just in case. I'm using my twig now just to put some thin purple lines onto the surface of the petals to create that sort of look of veins. You could use your watercolour pencil to do this, or even a sort of a very thin brush like a rigger to make those marks. So whatever you fancy doing and feel comfortable doing, that's the most important thing. So I'm using my size 6 brush, and I'm painting the shadow now of this top petal where it's curling over a little bit. It's creating a little bit of cast shadow. I'm using sort of a grey violet, so you could use some Payne's Grey with a little bit of pink even. I've even dropped a little bit of Quinacridone Gold in there, because sort of just that little bottom part of the petal there has got a real yellow glow, and I want it to sort of drift up into the shadow as well. I thought it'd be quite nice. It's really watery, this, and I'm letting everything sort of just merge and blend and keep everything loose. And I'm putting some little sort of marks in the petal now, using this very pale grey violet and using my size 6 brush, and this is wet on dry. You want your little shadow colours to be nice and cool, so you know, not too warm. And now I'm putting some of these marks as well onto the petals, wet on dry here and there. And I would say less is more as well, because sometimes, you know, when it sort of feels good, you think, oh, this looks good, yeah, and before you know it, you've literally just overworked it. You know, don't paint every blade of grass or every vein or anything like that. Sort of give an interpretation and an impression. It will really help your painting. And remember, and I always keep saying it, but it really works, and it works for me, less is really more. I'm using my size 6 brush now, just painting some really creamy darks just at the bottom of this centre here, where there's a little tiny bit of shadow, and I want to make this contrast so it really pops. And I'm just softening it here and using some water and just pushing and bossing around that little bit of paint there, just to kind of really make it look sort of like that yellow centre is raised up a bit and it doesn't look flat. And I'm using my twig just to pull out some of those marks here. Remember, as I did there, use your tissue. If you don't like something, just dab it as I'm doing there, because I thought, oh, that's a little bit too strong. So I'm just softening and dabbing here and there. But it leaves ghost marks behind, so you've got those initial sort of marks there, but not as dark. So you've still got those marks. And I'm just now mixing a little bit of Payne's Grey, and I'm just going to darken up this centre here. I'm using my size 6 brush, and this is wet on dry, and it's quite a milky sort of consistency. I've rinsed my brush and I just want to soften that again as I did earlier, and I'm pushing from the outside into the dark. Don't do it the other way around where you're pulling the dark out, because it'll go too far into the light of your flower and you'll end up having a grey flower. We don't want that. So I'm just putting a little bit more shadow now on the bottom petal here on the left hand side, with really just a bit of Payne's Grey. Actually, it's a really nice Payne's Grey, this, But you know, if you don't have a Payne's grey, you could mix up ultramarine and burnt umber or burnt sienna and you get really nice artist's Payne's grey. So there's a good little tip for you there. And again, I've just used my tissue there because it's a little bit strong. I'm just softening. So don't worry, just keep going and keep that tissue on standby, and just, you know, you can sort of wet it first if you don't like something, then lift off. I'm using a little bit of the Perylene Violet here with a bit of Payne's grey, and I'm just putting that on the bottom. You could use Payne's grey with a touch of pink, or Payne's grey with a bit of burnt umber, you know, something a little bit warmer in sort of shadow colour. And I'm sort of working outside in and just softening that edge. But I want it loose, this. I don't want it all sort of perfect like the photograph. I'm showing you a very loose, expressive way of painting where you get some beautiful sort of results and marks, magical things that only watercolour can do, sort of thing. That's why I love watercolours so much. And I'm just sort of putting little touches here and there on this left hand flower. I'm just adding a little bit more sort of a stronger, warmer, dark colour using some of the Quinacridone Gold and the Perylene Violet, but you could use a little bit of the Quinacridone Gold or raw sienna even with some burnt umber or burnt sienna with a touch of Payne's grey just to make it that bit darker. I'm just softening that again and I'm just lifting off. Remember that tissue on standby here, and I'm just pulling out some of that dark to make some darker marks on the petal, and using a little bit of the sandpaper with some brown as well on top of that damp paint just to kind of finish it off there with the textures. And I'm working a little bit again on this center part of the flower with my size 6 brush, just to really kind of just finishing off now, really sort of getting some of the details in the center here. And think of the center of this flower as the star of the show. So I'm just trying to really sort of raise it away from those petals to make it look a little bit more 3D. I've used some cerulean now with Payne's grey, and I'm just creating a little bit more stronger shadow just where the petal curls over, and just putting it on the edge there really sort of brings that lighter outside edge, really brings that out as well. And then just pushing up some clean water in there, and I just want to pop out a little bit more of these petals here, just where it's a little bit darker, especially this top petal. So I'm just putting a little bit of colour around the edge, the Payne's grey and the cerulean. I'm going to do a little bit down the bottom as well. It is like that in the photograph, but also it balances it out, otherwise it looks a bit odd, all that detail above and none below. So I'm just sort of painting that in there, and I have gone a little bit, I've realised later, I've gone a little bit skew whiff there with the dark at the petal below there, so I'm just correcting that now. Just remember, if you do anything like that, just wet it with some clean water, lift it off, and then make your correction. Just knowing that will make you feel more relaxed and more brave even when you're trying out these sort of loose style techniques in a watercolour painting. I'm just softening that dark there, just pushing in a load of water, and again using my tissue just to control it, and remember to keep the light and white of those petals as well. I'm just mixing up really leftover paint in on my palette there, but it could be a mixture of the Perylene Violet with a bit of the Quinacridone Gold, so a bit of violet and yellow, very watered down to create some of those darks there. And I'm just putting a little bit now of red and yellow, make an orangey colour, mix them together, and put some of that lovely sort of bright colour to create some texture around the outside edge of the centre there, just to really draw the eye in with that lovely warm colour. And it does make a beautiful, really gorgeous orange. And I'm using a little bit more of the lemon yellow in the centre. Remember, I had a little bit of watercolour pencil that I used earlier with the sandpaper, the little shaving, so I've got that there, and I'm just going to give that a little spatter now as well, just to keep, oh there's a lot of spattering there, but hey ho, it's good, we're loosening up. Spattering always gets me, it stops me from being tight, so I've just given it a good old spatter. So I'm going to remedy that, so don't worry. So I'm going to look at that later, so we can just let that settle. I'm going to concentrate on my stems now, but sometimes when I make a mistake or something I'm not sure about, I actually leave it for a bit. I don't panic. That's nice and wet and I can sort it, and so I'll think about it and I'll come back to that. So I've put some phthalo green actually, but you can use viridian, or you could use some Prussian blue with a tiny touch of yellow to get that very cool green. And now I've made a very, very dark creamy green. I've actually used the Perylene Green and some of the Payne's grey and even a touch of the Quinacridone Gold, just to create this really kind of colourful dark on those stems. It's difficult to tell from the painting here, but there's some really nice colours going on in there. So even when you're painting darks, make your darks really interesting. Just use my kitchen towel just to take out those spatters where I thought was a little bit too much. I'm just mixing up some of the lemon yellow with this deeper yellow, so it's sort of like a medium yellow, and I'm just painting a little bit of this around this sort of outside edge here, wet on dry, just building up the details using my size 6 brush. And as I said at the beginning of this, if you don't have the watercolour pencils, you can stipple in some of these sort of limey green sort of colour in the centre here, and I'm just softening some of those on the left hand side because I felt it was a bit too textured. And that's the lovely thing, we can just sort of change things in watercolour. Now what I'm doing here is I'm softening the outside edges of the flower. I've swapped to an older sort of sable brush because I didn't want to use my black velvet brushes for this because it'll wear them out. So I'm sort of just scrubbing away with this soft brush, and just to soften the edge, not to lift it off, just to kind of push it back a little bit into the background. Otherwise, when all the edges of the petals are all hard edged, it can look a little bit flat. And this way, some of the petals sort of merge into the background, others come forward, and it just creates a better look. Otherwise, it looks like a cut-out piece of a jigsaw puzzle. So that works quite nicely. And I just take off the residue paint with a kitchen towel, so it just softens it back. I'm just putting a little bit more of a sort of turquoisey colour to the right hand side here, just really popping out that centre. Again, rinsing my brush and then just softening, and it just sort of, it's lovely colour, and just pulling it in again with a twig to create some more marks. So you could use a little bit of the cerulean with a bit of Payne's grey for that colour, or even just a dark green as well. You can always tell when I'm getting nearer to the end of the painting, so I give it a little spatter, and it is my way of stopping myself from fiddling and overworking. So I'm spattering a little bit of the Quinacridone Gold, or whatever you have left over in your palette, which kind of creates a bit of colour harmony. There's a little bit of cerulean there. I'm actually putting it around the edges as well, just to push some of those petals back and others come forward, a little bit like when I was sort of rubbing off and lifting off those sharp edges as well. So it's another technique to do that. It also creates lots of texture, and I'm just spattering a little bit of dark green just at the top there, just the leftovers in my palette really. I'm using my size 4 brush to do this as well. It makes slightly smaller marks. Rinsing off my brush, I've decided to take off some of those spatters there. I just thought maybe they were a little bit OTT. You can always put them back on later, but I didn't want them to dry off, and I'm just remove my framing tape now to give that lovely white border, and this enables me to assess to see if I need to do any more to my painting. Again, it's another good time to maybe take a photograph of your work, to look at it, to be objective, to see if you need to do any more. And I've just put a few more little dark accents with my size 2 brush just around the centre here, just to finish off. And I'm using my stencil brush now just to lift off the centre. I just felt it got a bit busy, so I'm just lifting off the paint with this stiff brush, which is a hog hair brush. It's flat, it's very useful, but you could use a hog hair brush or just an old watercolour brush just to lift off. And I'm scrubbing around there as well, where I've got a few little hard edges, and then I'm lifting off again with my kitchen towel. It doesn't get rid of it completely, but it just softens it. I'm just adding a little bit more dark shadow to this stem. It's sort of paled off a little bit, so I'm using my size 6 brush, and a touch more dark to the center here with my size 4 brush to finish off, but I will leave it there for now. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial, and I hope it's given you an insight to the type of tutorials that are available on my Patreon membership, more in depth with lots more voiceovers and weekly exclusive tutorials with access to downloadable outline sketches. Thanks again for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.